I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago and far away in a pleasant country, there was once a remote farmhouse in which lived a poor farmer. His farm was small, but his family was very large, for he had 7 children, 6 daughters and 1 son. The 3 youngest daughters were still at school and had to study hard every day with their schoolmates, while the 3 eldest daughters were all married. They too lived on the farm with their husbands, working hard all day to make a living. Their husbands too helped out on the farm, for there was more than enough work for everybody, and the farmer made sure that everybody was kept very busy. At the best of times, it was extremely hard for this family to make ends meet, and to make sure that they had just enough to eat every day. Everybody was expected to work as hard as they could. Everybody, that is, except the farmer's son, Jon. Jon was a good boy, but the trouble was that his parents couldn't agree what was best for him. It was extraordinary that 2 people who loved their son so much could argue so bitterly over him. His mother felt that he should study and stay in the house. His father felt that he should be a farmer and work in the fields. His mother would say that working so hard was bad for him. He was much better off staying at home with his books. Then his father would say that studying would ruin his eyesight, and so they would argue to and fro, back and forth like a tennis ball. And the result was that although everyone else worked hard, Jon did absolutely nothing at all day. On one particular morning, when the farmer was loading the wagon to take some produce to the market, Jon rather fancied going with him. But then there was the usual argument between his parents whether he should go or whether he should stay at home. While they were arguing the toss, Jon just climbed onto the wagon until it was all over. And since he was in the wagon anyway, it was at last agreed that he could go with his father. It was such a pleasant day that the farmer soon recovered his temper and sang a merry song as the horses clip-clopped down the road to the market. And Jon, of course, was quite content. When was he otherwise? Doing the thing he liked best, which was staring up into the sky and watching the clouds sail past. The movement of the cart made him feel dizzy, so he looked down at the ground and watched the wheels spinning round. But that made his dizziness worse. The wheels went spinning, spinning, spinning. The horses' hooves went clippity-clop, clippity-clop, until Jon felt his own head spinning. He felt so giddy that he fell off the cart and lay in the road quite stunned, while his father, totally unaware of what had happened, carried on merrily singing. Jon was so dazed that it was some moments before he could get up and shout after his father. But by this time the cart was nearly out of sight, and the farmer simply didn't hear his son's frantic cries. Jon decided that the only thing to be done was to take a shortcut through the fields to the market and meet up with his father there, although he had only a hazy idea where the market actually was. However, after a brisk walk, he did indeed arrive at the marketplace, although it looked somewhat unfamiliar, and the people all seemed strangers. The market was certainly there, but who were all these people? He had never met any of them before, and nobody seemed to know his father. Although he questioned everyone he could, Jon couldn't find anyone who knew his father or where his stall might be. After he had asked the first, then the second, then the third person without any success, for the first time in his life, Jon began to worry. He had no idea how to get home, and if he couldn't get home, what could he do? Well, a kindly merchant saw the boy's downcast face and took pity on him. He soon got the story out of Jon and laughed heartily at his day's adventures. "Never mind, my boy," he cried. "Sons don't get lost that easily, you know. And while you are trying to figure out where your family lives, why don't you come home with me? My wife will be very happy to have you. And after all, there's plenty a fine, upstanding lad like you can do to make yourself useful." As it so happened, this merchant and his wife didn't have any children of their own, and were delighted to have a handsome and pleasant young lad to stay with them. He was made to feel at home immediately, although Jon, in any case, was so easygoing that he would fit in with anything that was suggested, as long as it wasn't work. The problem was that since he had never worked at home, he simply didn't know what to do now. He was very willing, but just did everything wrong. He would water the flowers with milk that was meant for the dairy. He would chase the geese with bed linen instead of hanging it on the line to be aired. Nothing he did was right. Because it seemed to him that work was so tiring, he would start off on a job willingly enough, but then a bright idea would come to him before he had finished his job, and another disaster would occur. Eggs meant for the dairy, for instance, made wonderful juggling balls, except when they broke. In the end, all Jon's misadventures quite wore out the merchant and his wife. They just couldn't get it into his head that he had to work, not play all day. The final straw came when the merchant, in desperation, decided to show Jon the simple task of painting a fence. Up and down on each pail with the white paintbrush. It certainly looked easy enough, and Jon found that once he had got the hang of it, he rather enjoyed it. Up and down went the brush. It was most relaxing, and while he painted, his thoughts could wander wherever the fancy took them, as they usually did. It was really very pleasant work indeed, and Jon was thoroughly enjoying himself. He couldn't understand what made the merchant so angry when he had done everything he had been told to do. "Thank goodness we don't have a son," the merchant cried. "He wouldn't be such a lazy good-for-nothing as you," cried his wife, "even if we did." From then on, they ordered him to do no more work, just do nothing. Well, that was fine for Jon. That was what he was really good at. All was well for a little while until one day the merchant had to take some goods to a nearby town, and Jon begged to go along for the ride. "Very well," the merchant agreed, "but don't do anything. Don't touch anything. Don't say anything. Just sit at the back." Jon happily agreed to this familiar condition, and all would have gone quite smoothly. But unfortunately, the merchant chose to drive over a very bumpy road. The milk urn soon spilled over, although Jon, mindful of the merchant's strict instructions, didn't say a word. Then Jon lost his balance and broke a whole basket full of eggs, purely by accident, and still didn't say anything. Then bags of flour began to bounce off the back of the wagon, but Jon obediently still didn't open his mouth. He even remained quite silent when he saw a back wheel come loose and roll off its axle. The merchant was livid with this last accident. "You must be soft in the head," he yelled at the unfortunate boy. "Why didn't you tell me what was going on?" He refused to listen to Jon's explanations and ordered him to fetch help immediately. He was so angry that Jon didn't wait, but ran off as fast as his legs could carry him. He was so frightened that he ran on and on without really knowing where he was going, until at last he had to stop, quite out of breath, by some fields where he realized that he was quite lost. "Now what will become of me?" he thought mournfully. "Things weren't like this at home. Nobody ever shouted at me. They just let me get on with my own life." He stumbled on, feeling very sorry for himself, until he came across a shepherd minding his flock of sheep. Jon was delighted to see a human being once more, and happily watched the shepherd while the man milked his ewes. The animals seemed quiet and gentle, and indeed it seemed a very relaxing kind of a job. If he had to work at all, Jon felt that this was the type of work he would like to do. Nobody to shout at him, but the gentle bleating of sheep and a pleasant outdoor life. He decided there and then to ask the man to take him on as apprentice and to teach him how to become a shepherd. The shepherd was rather surprised to have a pupil turn up out of the blue like this, but he willingly showed the boy how to make cheese from the ewe's milk. And in the meantime, the shepherd asked Jon where he came from, where he lived, who his parents were, and what he was doing here. Jon told him the whole story, and if the shepherd didn't quite believe everything that Jon said, nonetheless, he good-naturedly invited the lad to partake of some lunch. Jon didn't need a second invitation and stocked up the fire to boil the milk while the shepherd made his cheeses. Jon's efforts weren't very expert, but at least he tried, although the work was much harder than he thought it would be. He was ravenous when the shepherd finally produced his lunch and needed no second invitation to set to with a will. The shepherd, meanwhile, was beginning to realize that having a helper might have its advantages. It was hard work looking after a flock of sheep all on one's own, making sure that they didn't stray, that the wolves didn't get at them, and that they didn't hurt themselves. Shearing time was particularly hard work, and it would be very useful to have someone at hand to help. So, after the meal, the shepherd started Jon off immediately with the art of shearing. Of course, Jon wasn't the handiest shearer in the world, but the shepherd was very patient with him. The shepherd corrected his mistakes and showed him how to do it properly. The result was that because Jon was basically a willing boy, he soon got the hang of things and was able to be quite helpful to the shepherd. Jon listened to everything the shepherd told him very intently. He admired the enthusiasm with which the shepherd worked. He felt instinctively that this was the kind of work he would enjoy doing. The shepherd's spirits rose. The lad may not have known one end of a sheep from the other to begin with, but he seemed to be bright and willing. He might make quite a good shepherd after all. Jon's next task was to herd the sheep out of the fold and into the field where they could graze. Under the shepherd's watchful eye, Jon did well, and was most gratified to find what easy work it was. It was also rather fun. The sheep did exactly as they were bid, and were very soon scampering out into the field. "Now you must make sure the sheep don't stray," the shepherd ordered Jon. "You must keep watch all the time." But although Jon promised to do so, the noonday sun was so warm that he very soon drowsed off, and the sheep began to wander off, one by one. Fortunately, the shepherd was on hand to rouse Jon before all the sheep had gone, so there was no harm done, and all in all, Jon seemed to be doing very well, as long as the shepherd was there to keep an eye on him. Alas, the shepherd didn't know Jon's past history. He thought that the lad could be relied on while he had a short siesta, and ordered Jon to look after the sheep while he took his 40 winks. All went quite well for a time until Jon began to think that this work, like all the other work he had encountered, was very boring. Nothing seemed to happen. The sheep just stood, the shepherd slept, and everything was very quiet. Jon decided to liven things up. First, he got the sheep really moving, and then, having been so successful in herding the sheep into the field once before, he thought he would do it again, on his own. The sheep scampered away from this madman and ran straight through the haystack, sending it flying. The shepherd was furious. His hay was ruined, his herd was lost, and he had no doubt who the culprit was. Jan at first just thought the shepherd was playing and would soon recover his good temper, so he just sprinted off and lay down out of the way until things should return to normal. But the shepherd was in deadly earnest. It took him a long time to herd his sheep back into the fold and to settle them down, and he wasn't going to let Jan get off so easily. Very cautiously, carrying a heavy club with which to trounce the young rascal, he crept up to where Jan lay dozing. The lad realised then that the shepherd meant business, and he was very frightened indeed. Nobody had been so angry with him ever before. He was up and off with the shepherd in hot pursuit after him. Jan was nimble and the shepherd was weighed down by his club, but Jan still couldn't shake off his persistent pursuer, try as he may. Puffing and panting and quite out of breath, he jumped into the first refuge that offered itself, a large water barrel, and crouched down, quaking with fear. Unfortunately, the exhausted shepherd chose that same barrel to rest against while he got back his breath. Jan's hiding place was immediately discovered. With a great yell of delight, the infuriated shepherd turned the barrel on its side and pushed it down the hill, roaring with laughter as it bounced and rolled over the stony ground. "That'll teach you, you useless young whippersnapper!" he shouted, as poor Jan had to roll round and round in the barrel until it came to a grinding halt at the bottom of the hill, and he crawled out, bruised, stunned, and very shaken up. So shaken up, in fact, that he thought he was dreaming when he saw the rooftop of a familiar house peeking just over the hill. "That looks like my father's house," he thought. "But no, it can't be. I must be miles from home. But perhaps the people who live there will at least give me some shelter." It wasn't a dream after all. His barrel ride had taken him to the bottom of his father's furthest field, and he was soon sure that it really was his own home. He never thought he would be so pleased to see his family again. Everyone was so delighted to have him back that he realised how lovingly he had been looked after all these years. And he promised his father and his mother that they would never have to argue over him again, as from now on he would work hard, just like everyone else.